Good morning. We are in that time of year where everything blends together. We've got recruiting news on the football show, and we've got football news on the recruiting show. And luckily, Sean Fitz does both. So we don't even have to change guests. Our expert guest is Sean Fitz. He's here to talk about Penn State football practice, the latest news, and of course, the recruiting intel that you want to know. Going to get a couple things off right off the start of the show, Fitz, because I want to get these out of the way, and then we got a lot of stuff to get to. The first is to get all that recruiting intel, to get all that information. Subscribe to Blue White Illustrated right now, 2 months for $1. Promo code PSU1. That's your way in to get into the college football season and to give you access to that information for just $1. Try us out and see if you like it. Or just go all in and subscribe for the whole year. I would suggest doing that and joining us at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, because the information, we can't get to all of it here on the show today. Even if that was what we were going to do, there's just too much. But this show is brought to you by and made possible by the generous support of My Perfect Franchise. Andy Ludicky is a franchise consultant. Check him out at 404-973-9901. His services are 100% free. He's here to help if you have any questions about business ownership. Something he talked about that's new, actually, is that he is not just putting people into franchises where there's a structure and you go meet a CEO and you buy into an existing company. He also has a process where you can buy any business, any local business, small business. It never costs a dime for his services, and he can help you navigate the very choppy waters, as I learned, of buying a small business. You do get more information as far as profit and loss, all of these things, seeing exactly what you're buying when you're buying into an existing business, but he can help you navigate those waters. 404-973-9901. Of course, myperfectfranchise.net. He is a franchise consultant with almost a decade of experience putting people into franchises, including himself. So if you're looking for the next step in your life, your business career, the freedom to be whoever you want to be, talk to Andy. Andy at myperfectfranchise.net. Okay, Fitz, let's get to Penn State practice, which happened last night, and we have a fancy new intro for it. So, Fitz, what did you see at practice yesterday, and do you want to start with the news, or you want to start with your observations?
I'm going to start by thanking Andy and our sponsors, everybody that sponsors the site, sponsors the show. We appreciate you guys so much for doing that. It allows us to do what we do on basically a free platform here on YouTube, so we appreciate them. And if you have any interest in sponsoring us, hit up T. Frank. I know he's been doing a bang-up job getting us stuff. So he talked for the first 3 minutes about sponsors. I'm going to talk for 10 seconds, and then I'm going to switch to football because I know that's why Perfect. You're here. So we appreciate that. I liked your intro. I liked it opening with Drew Aller throwing a swing pass, because that was the furthest I think we saw a quarterback throw a pass last night. So if you're looking for, hey, how's Drew look? How's Bo look? How's Ethan Grunkmeyer look throwing the football? It was not during our window of practice last night. Nick Singleton. Nate's not on the show today, so I'm sorry, wobble. It's not going to happen. But yeah, we'll start with the obvious news of last night. Jamieal Lyons and Kaveion Keys not spotted at practice. We got a statement from Penn State spokesperson who said that they are on interim suspension. Let's just talk facts here right now. Both are still on the roster. Both are not with the team. I don't think it's a situation worth speculating on because it is an ongoing process. But that's the story right now, is Penn State's without those guys and preparing to be without those guys for the foreseeable future. So that's where we're at with that. It's a big hit. We're a football show, and we won't, again, get into the other stuff, but it's a big hit from a depth perspective, from a starter perspective. Jamieal Lyons, I think probably looking at this roster, the second highest draft ceiling of any player. You know, obviously you want this thing to play out and you want to see how it goes, but they're not with the team right now. And that hurts, and it hurts defensive end. It hurts linebacker. Linebacker was always thin. Defensive end has gotten thinner as Lyons not available. Zariah Fisher, of course, injured in the spring. So you're good at that position still, but it's a position that can get thin pretty quickly. Denai Dennis Sutton, Amin Vanover, and Abdul Carter, probably your three starters. You know, they do that at corner sometimes, as they like to say that we've got three starters, even though there's two positions, but you've got a couple of guys there, and then Smith Vilbert, the ultimate wild card there. So yeah, it's a hit on the defensive side of the ball from a football perspective, and other than that, we're not going to speculate. We're not going to talk about anything else.
Yeah. With that depth at defensive end, do some of those younger players now come into play, or is this really the top three, as you mentioned, and then kind of that's the roster at this point? Do they need one of those guys to step up, or all three of those guys are very good football players? And, you know, surprise, no surprise here, the defensive end position was my number one in the power rankings, which are coming out later today. Obviously, some of the news changes the depth conversation around that particular position where they had so much depth. But how does Smith Vilbert fit into this, in your opinion? And do some of those young guys now need to kind of take a step in order to buttress a very good starting three as of now?
We've talked about Smith Vilbert a bunch, and I've gotten a lot of feedback on him, more feedback than I expected personally. Like the last time we saw him was in the Outback Bowl. Of course, he's had the things that have cost him time, specifically the injury last year. And, you know, he set that record in the Outback Bowl with 3 sacks, but nobody came away from that, or nobody that watched that game came away from thinking that he was the next great Penn State pass rusher. He's now 290 pounds. So like he is freaking massive. He looks like a left tackle. Like he is a guy that's always had that giant frame. But we talked about it earlier this week on the show. He's a 5-tech type guy. He's not a pass rusher, but there is a role for those guys, especially in the Big Ten. So I think he fits in there. If you're doing a 2 deep, I think he's the number 4 right now. Penn State thinks he's an NFL guy. And again, it's not my evaluation there, but they see a lot more of him than I do. There was a situation this offseason where teams were trying to get Smith Vilbert to leave Penn State to join their team.
This is fascinating.
And Penn State kind of fought back to keep him. And none of this other stuff was at play at this point, but it's a situation where Penn State wanted to keep him because they thought he can be a really good player. I'm very curious how this is going to play out. You know, it's, of course, he's a long in the tooth veteran. He's an old guy on the roster, but also with that injury history, he's got the opportunity to play next year as well. He's 290 pounds. You look at defensive tackle next year and you think maybe this is a guy that fits into that mix. So he's going to play more football moving forward as long as he's healthy. So I'm very curious to see how this plays out. Would be lying if I told you I wasn't a little bit skeptical of the information, but it just keeps coming in positivity in terms of what Penn State thinks that he can do. So we're going to see if that can happen or not. I don't know. It's a high bar there at defensive end. Of course, with Abdul moving there, you get a versatile piece where you can play him at linebacker, and you've got him that's the linebacker DN hybrid. You've got a straight 5 technique in Smith Vilbert. You've got Denai, who is also maybe in that mold a little bit as well, but also can rush the passer, and then Amin is a guy as well. So I'm curious to see where the snap comes off, in terms of guys getting after the passer this year.
So it's super interesting. There's a couple things that have been kind of bouncing around in my mind about the defensive line. When they have so many big bodies, are they going to try and control with just 4? I know Manny Diaz pressure and pressure packages and the illusion of pressure was such a big part of what he did, and I'm assuming some of that will carry over. But when you're looking at, you've got bigger defensive tackles now. You've got enough guys that are 300 pounds plus. Zane Durant's super strong at his size. You've got a 292-pound defensive end. 270-pound Denai Dennis Sutton. One of the smaller guys here is Amin Vanover, who at one point was a defensive tackle at 260, and is it 266 or something like that? So are they going to try and play 4 and then play coverage in the back end, which is kind of a Tom Allen specialty of those coverages and having enough of those athletes to make things very confusing on the back end? Or are they just going to lean into what they did with Abdul Carter? And it's just that I feel like there's a lot of flexibility with that front 4 and how they can play it. And then, to the what you make me think of when you're talking about Smith Vilbert, because we're in the same camp of, I guess I'll see what they have in mind. Sometimes I feel like role players who maybe don't have a superstar position, but are integral to some of these things they want to do, they can get coaches excited because now it's like, okay, now I can do X, where before I kind of was limited to that. And I don't know, but it's just kind of speculation on my part that defensive line is so interesting given what they have and the diversity of the body types up front.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you look at what they did last year by putting the end over this, putting Chop over the center essentially and just wreaking havoc. I'm curious to see if that's Carter's role this year or how that works. But you've also, it's a situation where you probably don't want to take Zane Durant off the field in that situation either. Like there's
Right.
he's a guy that can get back there. So he's got options. You have fewer options now. It hurts depth. With the younger guys, it feels like, as we see at several positions, there's a break between those guys that we think we're going to see that, basically it was a top 6 at one point. Now it's a top 4. And then you've got that break with Mason Robinson. I don't know if Jalen Harvey's going to play this year in terms of contribute this year, but he's built to play, I guess you could
Big
say.
enough.
6'2", 263. Yeah. He's a tank, man. Still curious to see where his future lies. But yeah, it's interesting. Max Granville's on campus. We don't really expect that from him. Joseph Mukboy, again, one of those, he's still in that process of long-term development and things like that. So it'll be very curious to see how that works out. You've got options, but you'd rather have 6 than 4, obviously.
Yeah. Ironically, we've spent this time talking about the defensive line, and neither of us were really on the defensive side of the ball. You and I were on the offensive side. So let's flip over there. What did you see from Penn State's offensive players yesterday, or what were your general observations from practice?
I thought it was really interesting, and I knew this was going to happen, but I didn't really feel like it was I was going to notice it as much. But the opening up of the basically unlimited coaches here, like everybody was yelling yesterday. Usually you got your guys that come in and your position coach, you're like the 10 position coaches that everybody knows. Well, now you've got those analysts working there. If you're watching the video, Danny O'Brien's there. He's the quarterback's coach, but still technically one of those plus guys, those 10 plus guys. So Mark Dupuis was very loud. Frank Leonard does everything loud. David Rocco over there with the tight end. So it's almost doubling your on-field coaching staff. And I know that these guys have been involved, obviously, but it's a big difference in terms of what we saw at practice yesterday. And it allowed them to split some things up. So it gets your younger guys sort of acclimated. This is an acclimation. I'm watching Drew go through the shoot there. It's an acclimation practice anyway, heat acclimation, helmet acclimation, all those kind of stuff. But also these guys are just learning how to practice at Penn State. You're talking about guys that just came in, guys like Tysier Denmark and Peter Gonzalez on the offensive side. Garrett Sexton missed all of spring. So he's just learning how to practice. So just those little things. I mean, I saw Corey Smith going through the lines at running back. Like, that's a pretty wide-eyed kid right there. Like that's all coming together. So it gives you a chance to get these other guys. Charles Walker's working with the running backs, gives these guys a chance to sort of have a soft landing into there and figure out how things are going on, because it's complicated, man. Like we don't think about that, but like practice, there's a schedule and it is a tight ship that they run in terms of where you have to be and what you have to do. So the sooner you figure all that stuff out, the better off you'll be. And if they hope to get contributions from freshmen like Denmark, maybe like Gonzalez. Cooper Cousins been around for a long time. Nate actually wrote a story yesterday about potential freshman impact. I do recommend you check that out on BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. But it's an acclimation in every sense of the word. So I think that's sort of what I came away taking. Or that's what I took away from practice was it looks different now. And there's a lot of voices in that room, not to a detriment, but there's a lot of voices that are getting stuff done. I think that's really cool. But of course you're going to have that at every school. It's not a Penn State thing.
Yeah, but how you apply those resources does change. And some of the ways they were doing it, I thought were pretty intelligent, is how they were splitting up, especially early on in camp, splitting up the groups of players and trying to put, I think, the best groupings together in where you expect players to be and their learning curve and all of that stuff. So we'll have to monitor how those groups change between the position groups, if they change. Obviously, at some point, there's going to be the delineation of the depth chart between the D squad and the starting 2 deep, but that's a ways away. So there's going to be different things we can pick up during practice. And again, great time to subscribe to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com so you can get all of those insights. I did drop into the show notes my article from this offseason about Mark Dupuis, because he was, I think, to me, the standout analyst that I heard and saw yesterday. I was impressed with him. He did a virtual clinic that I actually purchased and then went through and learned a little bit about how he coaches receivers. Again, it's not surprising that guys are technical when you're a college football coach at a D1 school like Penn State, but the level of detail, the level of analysis, the level of, I think, just coaching and the process of explaining that information. Somebody like me, a layman who is sitting there learning and understands these concepts, football players, I think, can have a great opportunity to learn from him. And that was one where if we're hyper focused on the Penn State receivers, here's another reason why this group could take a step this year if they have more on-field coaching from a guy who has technical knowledge and can explain things as well as he did. Anything else from you as far as what you saw from practice, or do you want to get on to the recruiting stuff? On our recruiting show.
Yeah, take people behind the wall here and tell them why you were giddy yesterday. Excuse me, I don't know where that came from. T. Frank, you want to take the motion aspect of this as I clear my throat unexpectedly?
Yeah, so it's just an interesting thing of what's reasonable to talk about, because there are some things like politely you don't want to give away too much, but then again, even further behind the wall is like, hey, shoot single shots at players, don't give away anything about scheme. But when you're running motions that put two players in the same frame, I don't know what to do about that. Plus, we're standing far back enough that that's as close as I can get. Like you saw the highlights there. The receivers feel like they're going to be a part of this blurring the line between the run and pass game, motions. We talked about this in the spring. The quarterbacks are going to be part of the running game. And I don't know if it's just the way they're stacking practice where they're working on that stuff, the ball handling early on, and that's what we get to see. And then there's larger sections that matter more later of what they're going into detail, the traditional run game, the traditional passing game. But we're getting a lot of this stuff. We're getting a lot of these I want to be careful the words I use here. We're getting a lot of these new concepts from Andy Kotelnicki.
Kansas elements, yeah.
Kansas, yeah, going full Kansas, that I was like, I don't know if they're going to do that. And then you see some full Kansas stuff, and I go, well, okay, I guess like all bets are off here with the offense.
Yeah, and all you got to know is that he was giddy. T. Frank was just giddy last night after practice watching the nerd stuff. So that was pretty cool. So yeah, I think we can move on to recruiting now. But I wanted to get that out of there. So because when you're happy, the people are happy.
Yeah, I just if you're asking, is this offense going to be different? And James Franklin is talking about, we're doing a lot of the same stuff. Yeah, they're doing a lot of the same base concepts, but there is going to be some noticeable differences. If the way that they're practicing is any indication, there's some noticeable differences coming week one for sure. But it wasn't just the Penn State football players that were at practice and on campus and getting things going. Also, some recruiting news. Yesterday, I believe it was, or the day before, Ryan Snyder reported there were a couple of 2026 football players on campus. I know you wrote about that right before the show. So what do you want to tell people here about the latest recruiting efforts as that July window closes for Penn State football?
Yeah, it just actually put up a story on the site. Tyler Merrill was up once again, the offensive lineman from Cumberland Valley in Mechanicsburg, an hour and change down the road. He said an hour and 15 minutes. Like, I don't know, man. Mechanicsburg in an hour and 15 minutes, you got to be moving. But yeah, it's close enough to the Harrisburg area. Of course, Penn State picked up Kevin Brown from Harrisburg High, the offensive lineman, and Merrill was a guy that they offered, on a similar timeline as a freshman there. Different players. I mean, Merrill's 6'6", 325, 330, something like that. I think he's probably a guard at the next level, but it's one of those things. I think we're going to see Penn State in 2026 try and make a stamp in state. And they've already done so, but just kind of try and lock down and try and get away from what has happened in 2025 and try and make sure that doesn't happen again. So I think that Merrill getting back to campus is good. He went to Michigan and Notre Dame over the weekend. You look at his visits this year, he went to Alabama and Georgia in the spring, Clemson in June, and then he's been to Michigan and Notre Dame twice this year. Was at Penn State for camp. I think it was team camp in June, came back this Wednesday, took a January.
He was at a big man challenge as well with
that's
his
a team camp. Yeah, that's it. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, you're certainly good there. But no, Penn State continues to try and lock down Pennsylvania. That extends to the 2027 class. Maxwell Hiller, who is a guy that Ryan has just been over his skis about for basically the whole summer since he saw him at camp back in June. He was back on campus, and again, like Penn State's positioned themselves really, really well there. So it's kind of unexpected because you think about that July open period and you just think, okay, you get to the end of the weekend, everybody's shot, it's not happening. Then you have a practice on July 31st, a loophole, but not a loophole, if that makes sense. So getting these guys on campus for practice, pretty cool last ditch effort before you get to the season.
It feels like Penn State has been maximizing this July window from the Lash Bash, the final Lash Bash in the iteration we know it of, where they had two different barbecues and they were able to make some work in the 2026 class, and then here to even get in another one. So the recruiting efforts, as we mentioned, are not over. We'll be talking about what comes up next in just a little bit, but that wasn't even the news of the day in recruiting yesterday, because Penn State got 2 commitments on the same day that they opened camp. So Fitz, I think people have seen, or at least a lot of people have seen our videos from yesterday, our commitment series videos. I encourage you to check that out. You and I talked about Daniel Jennings, but I want to get your thoughts on Kaveion Keys, the defensive tackle who committed to Penn State yesterday. How do you feel about this 2025 edition, and your thoughts on the class now as it stands at defensive line?
This is a guy that I've liked for a while. I don't think he's a guy that contributes early, but I think that the long-term upside there, at least on paper, with measurements, with athletic numbers, with actually, I mean, with tape too. Like you look at his tape, and this is not a guy that doesn't know how to play football, but he is still fairly new to football. Plays defensive end. Read something yesterday about they needed an offensive lineman, so he stepped in and played offensive line. And you look at his offensive line tape, and he's not an offensive lineman, but I mean, I'm impressed that someone was able to step in there with legitimately short notice, no coaching or anything like that. And he did well. So that to me shows that you've got an acumen to handle this sort of thing. And I mean, acumen's kind of the name of the game with him. He's got anywhere you look between a 4.7 and a 4.9 GPA. I don't know. Like that's like what I had. So I don't even get up in that realm.
It's a theoretical number at that point when 4.0 is the max.
We're just making stuff up now. So no, I mean, he's a tremendous student, wants to get into engineering. And that was one of the things that I think took his recruitment on its own path, was he wanted to check out engineering schools and see where he could get into. I thought Virginia Tech was strong at play here. Of course, a strong engineering school, as well as Penn State and a couple others that he was checking out. Northwestern was in there. So there's a lot to like just in every aspect about Kaveion Keys. I think that he's a high ceiling prospect. Again, I don't expect him to pop early, but at the same time, you could see him maybe moving down that path that Xavier Gilliam did. This is a guy, I think he still believes his future's at defensive end, but you look at the nature aspect of this, and nature always wins. He's legit 6'3". He's 230 pounds right now. He's got 34-inch arms. He's got big hands. He's got a frame that's going to fill out, and I don't think it's going to take all that much for him to get there. So he enrolls at 245, 250, and then all of a sudden, I don't think he takes the drastic leap that Xavier Gilliam took. Gilliam's over 300 pounds right now, and I think he was 260 at this time last year. But I think he's on that path, and it's interesting to me. Ryan went down to that Under Armour camp, and I went down to the Under Armour camp the year before, and Gilliam worked out as an edge prospect, and he didn't look great as an edge prospect. But you shift him inside, something changes. Keys at this camp this year worked out at defensive end. He looked okay. I mean, he didn't look like a world beater. He looked good, but he didn't look crazy good off the edge. But you move that guy inside, and all of a sudden things change in terms of the level of athleticism there. So I'm excited about this pickup. I've always thought that this is a guy that could eventually end up in the class. You look at how defensive line recruiting went. I wrote my 3 things after this, basically about the defensive line recruiting. You started out with guys like Trent Wilson, Darren Kevon, and you kind of shift gears throughout that. Jarquez Carter, of course, committed to Ohio State right now. But you kind of shift gears and find out what comes back to you. And Keys was one of those guys that they offered early. I mean, this wasn't a guy that they brought in and just offered in camp, but they offered early, stuck with him, brought him in for an official visit at the beginning of June, and stayed with it. And that's ended up in this class. So very interesting combination of defensive linemen. You've got Keys now. You've got Randy Adarico, who was on campus this weekend working out for the staff. And it's going to be interesting to see how this develops down the line as Deion Barnes continues to sort of get more street cred in terms of the recruiting aspect of things.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up some of those details, because I talked around those when we were talking about him in the commitment video. And when I was talking about he can be a complete 3-technique defensive tackle, if he's 6'3", but he's got 34-inch arms, like that is an elite number where you can then project with some of the other measurables that he's got from a growth perspective, a guy who can be 295, 300 of lean muscle and be a penetrating 3-technique with power and violence and length and all the things you look for. So the upside here is impressive with the athleticism and the testing numbers that he's got. So that's why, we talk about a freaky athlete at defensive tackle. He fits that Penn State mold almost perfectly from what they're looking for at that defensive end-like player in high school who then shifts into defensive tackle at the next level. And, if he blows up in a way like Xavier Gilliam, or who's a good comp in your mind from a style perspective of the way he's built? The guy keeps coming to mind is Benedict Ume, and I know that he's a higher rated prospect and had a little bit more muscle mass on him at this point in his career. But in terms of like chiseled defensive tackle prospect with a lot of upside, he's somebody that just popped into my mind. I don't know if you've got a better one in terms of like what you think of Kemiju and where he can go.
No, that makes sense. I'm not prepared to make that statement right now. So
Yeah,
just no, I think that's Ume makes sense. It's just one of those guys. I mean, here's the thing, and I say this about pretty much every position. Don't worry about the weight. Like, don't worry about the weight. It's about the frame. It's about the sort of the mentality, the mindset, how things are gonna like come together in the next 3 years. So that's the way I go with it. So a 230-pound defensive tackle, certainly not the end of the world. It's a guy that's going to get bigger because of those arms and those, the features that he has.
Let's just do a quick recap of Daniel Jennings as well, who committed yesterday. Of course, you and I talked about Daniel Jennings on the commitment video from yesterday. But any other things you want to recap his situation? You want to recap what he means to this Penn State class of 2025 here for our live viewers on the BWI Live Show. So, what are your thoughts of Daniel Jennings adding to this particular class?
Yeah, he's got some potential as an edge rusher down the line. Again, he's a little bit in that tweener mold right now, 6'1.5", 6'2", 225. Has worked out at linebacker for the staff, has worked out at defensive end. We've got him as a 4-star prospect on the industry rankings, number 189 nationally on 3, with a 3-star rating there. And I think that's fine. He can get after the quarterback. I'm curious to see how his transition goes. He played in Virginia last year across the border from where he's going to play this year in Princeton, West Virginia, which is all the way at the bottom of Virginia. Like if you're driving to Charlotte on, that's like the area you're going to. So like it's going to be a process to see where he fits in, but they like him a lot. He's athletic, he can bend well, and he's got a lot of things working for him. Productive football player, all-state player as a sophomore, can get after the quarterback and also does on the offensive side of the ball as a running back, which is good to see. We talked about that football acumen a little bit earlier. So a good pickup for Penn State as they get hot and stay hot in the class of 2026.
So that is a big part of what happened this past week. Of course, we talked about the Lash Bash and some of those recruits on Fitz's recruiting update on the Tuesday show, so we probably won't rewind too far to talk about those guys, but it has been a big week for the class of 2026 as they've added, I'd say, a significant number of players for a class so far away at this point, but 2025 still very much in view for the Nittany Lions. Not done with that particular class. We've got an upcoming decision this weekend. Kobe Howard has moved up his commitment date. Ryan Snyder and I actually, and this is a good time to promo this, Fitz, is we're going to have a additional podcast coming out tomorrow, but it's only for subscribers. So yeah, Fitz and I and Ryan, we talk about the things, and I don't know if I should be talking about how long certain arm length and reach or things are because you want to be delicate with some of those details here live in the public. Well, if you want lack of delicacy on those ideas, Ryan and I are talking about Lash Bash, reviewing that stuff, talking about some prospects. He gives you his full-fledged, full-force thoughts coming up, and that is only for subscribers at bluewhiteillustrated.com. I'm going to just throw this up once again. Shameless promotion is what my job is here. 2 months for $1. Code PSU1, and you can get into that premium podcast talking about recruiting and some of the things that we really think in depth about these prospects. We're going to be doing more of those as they happen. As there's a need for them, we're going to be doing these premium stories and premium podcasts over at bluewhiteillustrated.com. This one a little bit longer. Of course, like we were talking, we'll go like 20 minutes, and it would end up being 40 minutes.
You weren't on the text with one, because I asked Ryan to do this because I think we're going to not move, but we're going to do more of that for our subscribers at Blue White, so we can be a little bit more in depth and we can be a little bit more comfortable, I think, with some of the words that we use. As you mentioned, but I said, we want to get you on screen before you go on vacation, just because the people want to hear from you, obviously. And he's like, okay, what do you think in 20 minutes? I'm like, no, tell T Frank 10. And then he texted me later. He's like, we went 40 minutes. And I'm like, so can't encourage you.
There is some editing that's going to happen. It's going to be a little bit shorter. So Don't worry about that. I was afterwards, I was like, man, that was too much. So we'll see what ends up being when we get it out. It's going to be coming out tomorrow. So have a look at that. But one of the things we talked about there was Kobe Howard, and of course Kobe Howard changes his decision date after we record the show. So that's a little detail, a little nugget on the podcast. So let's talk about Kobe Howard now. The decision upcoming. What's your view of what's happening there?
Sunday afternoon, 3 p.m., I believe it is. Kobe Howard was at Penn State over the weekend. He worked out for the staff. This is one we've been tracking since his official visit, actually before that, but since his official visit in June. It seemed like Kobe Howard wanted in. It seemed like Penn State was, sort of keeping that one at arm's length with guys like Lex Cyrus still out there, with some of the other prospects that obviously went elsewhere. But they brought him in this weekend. Again, we said they were gonna work him out. They did so. It was a good workout. I mean, I think that things are trending Penn State's way. If you look at the RPM, I know Chad Simmons put one in yesterday. I know Steve Wiltfong either put one in yesterday or early this morning, but things seem to be trending Penn State's way for Kobe Howard on Sunday afternoon. Would give Penn State a third receiver in this class. Obviously, that's been a sore spot for a lot of people that are following Penn State right now, is how do you fill in that gap? And I think there's still more action to come in 2025, a little bit later, but this seems to be the most logical action and the most logical next step for that group.
So what do you think of the potential of a class that has Lyric Samuel, Jeff Exener, and Kobe Howard? And I do want to ask it, given what they had on campus and the receivers that came through during the summer for the official visit schedule. We had the conversation. I said, you almost can't mess this up with how many of those players were, I thought, quality players that moved the needle from a receiver perspective. Given that, it's trending Penn State's way, how do you feel Kobe Howard affects the overall class, and then in context of what they had and what they may have here at the beginning of August, excuse me?
Yeah, probably something we'll talk about later this weekend, but good football player. Like, I think that gets lost in this sometimes. He's a good football player with the ball in his hand, especially after the catch. That was one thing that sort of people that were stumping for Kobe Howard, said this is a guy that can do things after the catch that a lot of our guys haven't shown that they could do. Now, obviously it's at the high school level, so it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to see how that athleticism transfers over. But he's a guy that can make plays. He's playing at Chaminade Madonna, one of the top talent producers in South Florida, a spot that Penn State's, Jay Sider's got a very good reputation there, very good relationships there. So I think that comes into play as well. But the thing I keep going back to, he's just been very productive. Like, it's not a situation where he's going to blow you away in any one aspect, except you look at the numbers and all of a sudden at the end of the game, he's got, 6 catches for 140 yards and 2 touchdowns. Like that are the kind of things that matter. So I think that's where you're going with that. The group with Lyric Samuel and Jeff Exener, different body types, although Exener has dropped some weight. So I think it's that conversation is sort of going by the wayside. But different body types, different styles. Be curious to see what they continue to press for. I think they still do look at guys. I mean, they're going to stay on Lex Cyrus. They're going to stay on maybe Matthew Ott, and they're going to stay on some of these guys that they missed out on. And it's a long time until December. So we'll see what happens with that. But I think that Kobe Howard came up, did enough to show that he can belong up here, and Penn State's ready to take him.
And that's a perfect transition into the next part of this particular conversation. Sorry, I'm looking for this from Cheng Yufeng. Says, so is this the only practice recruits could go to? Fitz, how does the recruiting calendar change now that we're into August? And how does Penn State handle recruiting in this particular month?
They don't. So it's dead period right now. So yesterday was the only practice that recruits could go to because the dead period came into effect on August 1st. So they won't be able to go anywhere. And it's a good thing. Like, these guys are starting their senior, junior, sophomore seasons, whatever it may be. And Penn State and all the college coaches across the country are trying to figure out what they're doing with their own team. So August has been off the board for a while now. And I think that's the right decision. The only loophole there would be at the end of the month. Like, West Virginia is going to be able to host guys on August 31st. If you're hosting a game before that deadline, you can basically get a useless waiver. I mean, we're still doing waivers here, but you're able to host prospects at that point. So everything for on-campus visits, and coaches can't go anywhere. Coaches can't evaluate or anything like that. You can't have any in-person conversations is the word I was looking for, as I can't talk, which is pretty ironic. But you can't have those until September. And then, Penn State will start getting guys back on campus in September for games.
Yeah. So I guess the next big moment in recruiting is when they host their first game. But there are other names in the class of 2025, I think, that are still out there. You mentioned some of the flip candidates. How do you? Because I'll be honest here, he's so quiet. I keep forgetting about Malachi Goodman, but I know this is a guy who's out there. How do you handle, or how are you viewing that particular conversation around Penn State adding another one of their top remaining uncommitted players on the 2025 roster? And do you have any sort of rough idea of if there's a timeline on his decision process?
No, I think he's on his own time right now. He's not a guy that's being rushed. If he was, he would have been in a class by now. Again, we keep going back to the three with this one: Penn State, Auburn, USC. I don't know how much attention he is paying to it right now, and I don't know if this is a situation where he wants to go into the fall and maybe take a couple visits there, or just wants to let it play out and see if he's got this feeling about anything in particular. But we will see. I think Penn State's right in it with Malachi Goodman, but he's a quiet kid, so it's tough to say. Obviously, I don't want to say obviously, but probably Penn State's most important target left on the board. You look at the offensive line class, and they could use a bona fide stud tackle, and I think Malachi Goodman is that. It's an interesting time in transition for this 2025 board, because you see coaches following guys, you see coaches following guys that are committed elsewhere. It's almost a reshuffling of the deck right now, where you're trying to take the targets that you already have, guys like Kobe Howard, guys like Malachi Goodman's, a couple other ones here, Mathis, I saw somebody mention in the chat, and those guys, but also you've got space to reshuffle and sort of figure out who these guys that are going to go, or that might blow up as seniors, that might be in a situation that might blow up with coaches getting fired and things like that. So you got to be on your toes. So that board, while it's not expanding, there's a lot of names internally that are being kicked around for evaluations to say, if this kid blows up, this is one that we want to be positioned for.
Yeah. Because senior film, we always talk about everybody has a different development curve. Some guys might have taken a big leap this offseason, and there's new evaluations to do during their senior season. But for a lot of players, their junior film is what determines the interest level. That kind of, do you blow up and become a prospect that a team like Penn State wants to have as part of their class of 2026? So that is a large part of what happens over the next couple of months, I imagine. Right now, they've got 5 players in the class. So I wanted to have this conversation about, this is as aggressive of an early start that I've seen from Penn State in my time covering recruiting for a class that is technically 2 years out. So is this intentional, or is this a random lucky happenstance where they're able to get so many players join a class early in their recruiting cycle?
It's not really lucky happenstance, but it's a case-by-case basis, and that's what recruiting is. You take a look at the guys that they've gotten so far, done well close to home. Kevin Brown is a guy that has the profile of a guy that could take it all the way to signing day if he wanted to. He didn't want to. So, that's lucky happenstance, I guess you could say, but they did a really good job recruiting him. They stuck with their evaluation for Jasir Rogers in Delaware. Of course, Troy Hune, the quarterback dominoes. I mean, you take recruiting in one pot, and then you take quarterback recruiting in another, because the dominoes are what dictates how things follow there. Messiah Mickens jumped on board almost a year ago, which is just crazy to think, because he's still got over a year until he signs. So that's a long time to be committed, but he looks pretty committed there. So, I mean, it's just a case-by-case basis, and you look around what they have in the region, and if the region's good, this is typically how they start. I think 2025 has been a bit of an outlier. It's happened before, as we mentioned in 2021, but it's few and far between, and it happens less often than the alternative. So I think Penn State is doing that. And I think there's an emphasis on Pennsylvania, not necessarily in the sense that they're going to take Pennsylvania kids just to take Pennsylvania kids, but 26 might be a pretty decent year in Pennsylvania. So we will see what happens with that. I think it's you go to the restaurant and you order what is available to you, and sometimes it's great, and sometimes it's just not what you're looking for. And I think in 2026 so far, it's been top of the menu.
Yeah. So it's an interesting dichotomy between 25 and 26, and also I think the NIL conversation can muddy the water. So it's the reason to ask these questions, I guess, from my perspective, to try and understand a little bit better of what's going on, is there a change in NIL? Is this a case-by-case basis? Or is there, has there been an adaptation, or is Penn State getting these guys early, trying to get ahead of some of those things? And ultimately, I think the conversation usually comes down to, what's the kid like? And as you mentioned, Kevin Brown, what's the kid like? Does he like recruiting? Because you can go back to Javen Williams being a similar player who's like, I don't really want to do the recruiting game, commits to Penn State and stays through with that particular commitment. So it's just finding which variable it is between classes is interesting, because I asked openly this question, like, does NIL create an invisible cap on Penn State's recruiting if this trend continues? And then so far in 2026, very much it didn't. So as we get new information, it just feels like you've got to continually ask these questions.
It hasn't yet. It will at some point. Like because I think when you get, and this isn't even an NIL situation. Like Penn State used to get, it's some of its most solid commits, and sometimes not, but some of its most solid commits were the early ones and the low maintenance ones. And that's what I keep going back to is you've got guys in this class that, Kevin Brown is a borderline 5-star, but everything that comes with that in terms of reputation of 5-star prospects, prima donnas, all that, you don't see that with him. Like, and I think that's something that you take into account there. So NIL will be a factor in 2026, just like it was in 2020 or has been in 2025. But like the guys that you're getting right now don't seem to be the ones that are prioritizing that. Maybe that's something that comes back around later. But like, if NIL was a big deal to them, they probably wouldn't be committed yet, because you can bounce these off of different schools. You can bounce counter offers and everything like that. So I think that's something to take into account. Again, really good start for Penn State. I think they've got some not only really good players, but also really good kids so far. And I'm encouraged by the way that they've started. And again, that there's something to peer buzz. There's something to, hey, these guys see something in Penn State, so why can I see something in Penn State if I'm a big time recruit? So be interesting to see how that sort of continues to build. Again, NIL ain't going away. It might be transitioning, changing, and all that kind of stuff, but it ain't going away. So at this point next summer, the conversation might be different, but right now it's going pretty well.
Any other thoughts? And even if you wrote about this and you just want to promote the article, any other thoughts about the class of 26 and that idea of the buzz that's been generated by having 5 players here at the beginning of August? Anything, last thoughts here on the class and maybe what you're thinking about, or you've written over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com?
Well, actually, funny you ask, but on the 3rd anniversary of On3 launching on August 1st, Steve Wilfong just tweeted that he's got a story about Penn State in 2026. So I encourage you to check that out. I'm actually trying to, if you see me looking down, I'm trying to read it myself to be informed with what Steve has to say, because Steve is the best in the business. So really encouraged to see that. And he's got some good comments in there. So I just recommend you check that out.
Yep, of course, BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, the place to go, because when Steve writes stuff about Penn State, either he or Chad Simmons or somebody else posted on the message board, or it's directly on our main page, so that national information and some of those, those Wilfong bombs find their way to our page. Of course, the On3 app is another great way to get all that information and news. We're launching some updates and some things going on there. Excited to talk about that more in detail in the future, but for now, just know On3 generally and BlueWhiteIllustrated.com not done evolving, not done bringing you the best in Penn State football and, of course, recruiting coverage. Fitz, appreciate you today. That's it for our show. We'll be back again with our premium podcast coming up tomorrow. We don't have a good name for it. I called it BWI Live Plus, but I'm exhausted by people just putting plus at the end of everything and calling it good. We'll find a better name for it. We'll find a better intro for it, all that stuff, but we want to get you that information. That's tomorrow. So check all that out. And of course, we'll be back for James Franklin's press conference and all the news coming up for Penn State Media Day on Saturday. So don't go anywhere. There's all kinds of stuff, all kinds of information that you need. So subscribe here to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com on YouTube. We'll be back.